Hello and welcome to part 2 of my video on Christian Zionism in America. Now, I'm going to assume, and this is almost definitely going to be the case, that for most of the people watching this, for most of the small audience that I'm sort of lucky enough to have gathered, it's going to be this part, the second part of the video, that's going to be the most interesting for them, because it's going to be in this part that I actually discuss the existence, the prevalence, the evolution of Christian Zionism in America specifically. I only took the time, all of that time, to discuss Christian Zionism as it existed in England and the Judeo-centric tradition of prophecy interpretation that accompanied it, because it was essential to understand what follows. And once again, just for the sake of a recap, the book that I am discussing is More Desired Than Our Own Salvation, The Roots of Christian Zionism by Robert O. Smith. Wonderful book. I sort of suspected that it would take 2 videos to finish this discussion, even 2 very long ones like I tend to make, because the book is very dense. There's an enormous amount of information in it, and I want to convey it all to you. I want to give you the full story so you know what's in there and you understand the value of this book. Now, to give a quick recap of where I left off, because of the work of a number of Christian Zionists, even starting from John Bale, but eventually becoming more and more Judeo-centric and pro-Jewish, starting with Henry Finch, and then moving on to Manasseh ben Israel, who was not a Christian. Because of the work and the intellectual influence that all these people have had over the course of time, they eventually managed to convince the government, as led by Oliver Cromwell, to reverse the prohibition on Jews entering England that was enacted in 1290 by King Edward I, and to allow Jews to enter England. Puritans were, of course, very excited by this and immediately set to work trying to convert Jews to Protestantism, only to find, to their chagrin and disappointment, that they in fact were not converting, that a conversion, if one happened at all, happened once in a blue moon, and for the most part that all the Jews in England wanted to do was to just, sit there in their own communities, trade amongst the Englishmen when necessary or when they desired to do so, but to stay amongst themselves and not assimilate and remain in their own communities. So they weren't converting, and these apocalyptic hopes were not being fulfilled in the literal way. This led to a great amount of disappointment among many of these English Protestants, and so hermeneutical interpretation changed from having a strong emphasis on literalism to being more in favor of a more allegorical interpretation, of maybe something like a preterist theology, a preterist interpretation. Preterism means that that is the view that the prophecies that are described in the Bible are not really prophecies, they're sort of allegories for things that have already happened, rather than for future events. That started to arise. Philology started to be used in hermeneutics by people like Spinoza, Grotius, and Hobbes, and so on. However, because of the relative isolation of the American colonies from the events in England, this sort of moving away, this recoiling from literalism in hermeneutics did not take hold in America in the way that it had in the English colonies. So to start my discussion of the United States, I'd also mention briefly the mayor of the Massachusetts colony, John Winthrop, and his famous City on a Hill speech. God, I'm sorry about that. Anyway, his famous City on a Hill speech. I'm sorry. Okay. Anyway, so John Winthrop, City on a Hill. He said that... What the hell? Alright, good. Alright, John Winthrop. Sorry. So, he gave this great motivational speech in 1630 to his fellow members of the Massachusetts colony. And he did this in order to sort of promote togetherness and Christian cohesiveness and charity amongst one another, and he did many things in this speech. The phrase "city on a hill," of course, comes from the Sermon on the Mount, but he compared the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony to the Jews, saying that like the Jews, they were expelled from their home, like the Jews, they were persecuted, and like the Jews, they had a special covenant with God, a special mission given to them by God, a special role in history that was divinely ordained just for them. Now, this really was the beginning of what eventually emerged to create not only Christian Zionism, but a general kind of ethos in America and the general idea of American exceptionalism. And I hope that I can talk about this well enough and get you to understand it. Now, before I do, though, there is another book by Richard Gamble called In Search of a City on a Hill, which I have not read. And he does talk about the origins of American exceptionalism and the drive for the American empire and so on, and all of this kind of messianic thinking held by people like the neoconservatives that the United States needs to go out and promote democracy and so on. He talks about the idea that this started with the City on a Hill speech, and he doubts it because that idea of American exceptionalism as it exists today essentially has nothing in common with Winthrop's what Winthrop was trying to express. And in Smith's book, he does. Now, I haven't read Gamble's book again, so I'm not an expert on that topic. But Smith does acknowledge this in a way, and I'll get to it. And he discusses sort of like a divergence, a change from this original tradition. But after John Winthrop, the major theologian, the major discusser, the person, the next major figure here that I'm going to discuss in terms of Judeo-centric prophecy interpretation and eschatology is the Reverend John Cotton. Starting in 1639, he gave all of these millenarian and Judeo-centric speeches, also tying in this idea that the United States, or the New England colony, the people comprising it, had a special mission from God, that they also were chosen as the Israelites were chosen, and so on. He repeated these themes. This all began to develop further in the work of one of Cotton's friends, a man with a kind of a strange name, a man by the name of Increase Mather. At least I think that's how you pronounce his first name, because it is spelled exactly like the word increase. But anyway, in 1669, Mather published a book called The Mystery of Israel's Salvation. In this book, Mather insisted on a literalist interpretation of biblical prophecy and of the Bible generally. He was aware of the anti-literalist trends that were occurring in England. I mentioned that the American colonies were isolated from the political events going on there, and they were isolated, but not completely isolated. They knew what was happening. So Mather was aware of it, and he defended biblical literalism against these sort of anti-literalist tendencies. He insisted that we must interpret the Bible literally. He said that if we do not interpret the Bible literally, if we allow ourselves to go into metaphor and allegory, then eventually we'll sap all the meaning out of religious faith and it won't mean anything. We should just take it literally at its plain meaning as it is, according to Mather. Then he, continued all of these same themes of Jewish conversion, national conversion, the return of Christ, the destruction of the Catholic Church, the return of the Jews to Palestine, and the concomitant destruction of Islam that would accompany this, and so on. Now what I'm about to discuss after this was very important in the formation of American identity and American nationalism. In 1634, Joseph Meade was talking about the American colonies and was asked for his opinion on them. And he essentially said that he wished the colonists well. He did not want any harm to come to them. He thought, he was, praying for their safety and so on, and wanted them to flourish. But he did not think that America had any importance in an eschatological sense. He even said that he thought that America was the land to which Satan had fled with his army, had fled with his minions and so on, and hidden there because Christ's message and the forces of God, the forces of good, had taken over the rest of the world, and so Satan, according to Mead, retreated into America. So that's why you have all of these, all of these kind of indigenous people who know nothing of Christianity and so on. Now, I mentioned in the last video that there was, for a while, a lot of speculation that the people found in the Americas were actually the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Well, the speculation about this kind of died away after attempts to convert these people to Christianity in large part failed miserably. So then you had, views like Mead's take over. Now, what's interesting is that in the 1690s, about 60 years after Mead's death, a few of these New Englanders begin responding to what Mead had to say about America, about the place of the American colonies in end times prophecy, in biblical interpretation. It's the role that it has to play in the millennium in general. One of the respondents was Judge Samuel Sewall, and he had a very nice phrase, very interesting phrase in his response to Mead that he used. He said that he wanted to respond to Mead's belief, which he said was, quote, the antic fancy of America's being hell. And so essentially, in his response to Mead, Sewall was saying that he not only disagreed with Mead that America would have no place in the millennium, but he even believed that it would be the geographical location of Jerusalem, that it was in America, not in the physical, geographical, literal Jerusalem, that the New Jerusalem was to be placed, but it was in America. And accompanying this was this kind of, extreme nationalism and patriotic fervor, because Sewall took offense to what Mead had said about America way back. He'd said that essentially that America was this kind of, satanic hinterland with nothing to recommend itself. And he didn't like this. Now, in addition to Sewall, another respondent was Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather was the son of Increase Mather. And Cotton Mather was not quite, he did not quite display as much patriotic fervor as Sewall did. He did not dare, for example, to say that the seat of Christ's kingdom upon his return would be located in America. He continued the general belief that it would be in the physical, geographical Jerusalem. But he nonetheless said that he thought it was unreasonable to believe that upon Christ's return, America would have no role in the millennium, that it would just be abandoned, that nothing would come of it. And he sort of responded to this. And in these responses, you can see an emerging, nascent kind of American nationalism being born. So these people like Mather, people like Sewall, were defending America and advocating for, if not a central place in end times prophecy, then at least a place. And so this holding on to this tradition of Judeo-centric prophecy interpretation mixed together with their own feelings of American patriotism to create literally a kind of civic religion in the United States. Now, I should discuss Cotton Mather further because he was quite an interesting guy. He was very interested in Islam. Sort of Islamic culture, the Ottoman Empire. He wanted to know as much about the Turk, as it was referred to then, as possible. At that time, something that was very popular among people to read, among New Englanders to read, was narratives of people that had been captured by Native Americans and their experiences. Well, in addition to things like that, Mather, because of his knowledge of Islamic culture, also wrote quite a bit about the Barbary pirates and what happened to people that they took as their prisoners. And his writing to this effect also helped quite a bit in the formation of American nationalism. He would write about how the captives of the American captives of the Barbary pirates would suffer and what they would go through, and the need for them to hold on to their Christian faith and persevere through their adversity because God would save them if only they if only they had faith, and so on. So it sort of served to confirm and consolidate American national identity by highlighting this enemy in the by Barbary pirates. Now, as Mather got older, he sort of also became more acquainted with the non-literalist trends and hermeneutics back in England, and he was saying, all sorts of things. Everyone was talking about the millennium, and it just wasn't coming. People said it would happen in 1697. It didn't happen in 1697. People said it would happen in 1716. It didn't happen in 1716. His own father, Increase Mather, had died in 1723. It just wasn't happening. And at that point, Cotton Mather began to wonder if maybe a purely literalist approach to interpreting biblical prophecy was not the right one. And so he tried to seek this sort of hybrid approach to it. Now, after all of this, I should say another thing. Actually, I'll get to this after I discuss one more person. The next person to talk about, who's very important after Cotton Mather, was a man by the name of Jonathan Edwards. Now, some of you possibly may know who Jonathan Edwards is by having heard about this really powerful fire and brimstone sermon that he delivered at one point. It's very famous. It's one of the most famous pieces of literature produced by Puritans. It's a sermon called "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." Very sort of, with vicious kind of powerful sermon with all this grandiose apocalyptic and hellish imagery. But in addition to that, which is probably what Edwards is most famous for, he was also deeply enmeshed and involved in this tradition of Judeo-centric prophecy interpretation. So, for example, in the year 1757, a year before his death, Edwards wrote to the College of New Jersey, informing them about a book proposal. He was working on writing a book that would detail the entire history of salvation and the concept of salvation. It was sort of this macro-historical work that he had planned, which he hoped would show that God's working was present. God's work was present throughout history. That God's touch was everywhere, and that salvation was sort of the ultimate thing, the greatest thing throughout history, and that it was an ever-present idea and an ever-present force throughout it. As you might have guessed, given that this book was proposed a year before Edward's death, he never finished it. But he did write other things. So, for example, in 1747, he wrote a book called A Humble Attempt, or An Humble Attempt, because the H was silent as it was pronounced back then, but A Humble Attempt. And in it, he again counseled his fellow Puritans to maintain the faith, because in the 1740s, there had been this great religious revival in America, and this burst of apocalyptic fervor, and it was just sort of going crazy. But again, after a while, it sort of fizzled out when people began to see more and more the events being prophesied were not coming to pass. And Edwards was just telling them to have faith, that it's in the hands of God, and so on, and repeating a lot of these Judeo-centric themes. National Jewish conversion, elimination of the Catholic Church, elimination of Islam after the coming of Christ, etc., etc. And also premillennialism. I had mentioned Cotton Mather and the changes to his sort of hermeneutical outlook, given the events that he had experienced. Mather also became, like Henry Finch and Joseph Mead, eventually became a premillennialist. So he said that he believed the Jews did not have to be converted. This was towards the end of his life. He believed the Jews did not have to be converted. that the only thing preventing the events of the apocalypse from starting and from being set into motion is essentially the will of God. That Christ could come down at any moment. That it was all of his choosing, and that there were no essential preconditions to it. You didn't have to convert the Jews. Edwards seemed to believe this as well. Now, what is interesting is I mentioned how among American colonists, they began to sort of identify themselves with Jews. They began to see themselves as possibly like a second Israel, and you see this most explicitly in Samuel Sewall's response to Joseph Meade. But this belief comes out especially powerfully in the years leading up to the American Revolution to form what a historian that Smith quotes in his book named Nathan Hatch refers to as civil millennialism. So what he means by civil millennialism is this idea of civic or patriotic duty or political interest or involvement being combined with millenarian prophecy to create this kind of, civic belief system where sort of your political and your national identity mixes in with your religious beliefs. And this was something that was being done to an enormous extent among New England, and by extension among all the colonies, because compared to all of the other colonies, all of the other sections of colonies in America, English colonies, New England dominated in terms of intellectual influence. So all of these ideas were coming out of New England, and the other colonies did not even come close in terms of putting out ideas of this sort. But, so, as I said, Americans more and more began to see themselves as the new Israel, the second Israel, the new Israelites, the second people within God's covenant. And when the British government began to grow tyrannical in the years leading up to the American Revolution, and they passed things like the Stamp Act in 1765. This tradition of Judeo-centric prophecy interpretation, this view of the Turco-Catholic Antichrist, this was easily converted and turned over and combined with this American civil millennialism in such a way as to make the British government Satan, to make the British government the Antichrist. And so the Revolutionary War came to be seen by many of these Puritans, many of these people descended from this Puritan stock, as being a grand cosmic apocalyptic struggle between good and evil. Now, there's a lot that's said, many historians about the American Revolution, that the general story is that the founders, they liked John Locke and they read their John Locke and they believed in limited government and property rights and all these wonderful things that I agree with, and I think property rights are great and I like John Locke too. But the point is that the influence of this kind of eschatological millenarian Puritanism on the ideological foundations of the American Revolution is grossly, enormously understated. So it's this civil millenarianism that was the ideological engine, for the most part, behind the American Revolution. And upon the gaining of independence by the American colonies and the formation of the United States of America, this idea became embedded into American national identity. It became a part of what it meant to be American, that Americans were the new Israel, the new chosen people, the holders of another covenant with God, the Redeemer nation, even, you could go so far as to say. And this became a part of Americanism. This puritanical belief that we are the chosen people, that we are the chosen nation, that we are the bastion of freedom from the evil, satanic, tyrannical force of something like the British government. This was believed by them. And you can already see the similarity between that belief, that kind of civil millenarianism, and the modern American civic religion of American exceptionalism, and how America stands for democracy and freedom around the world, and how it's its duty to spread these wonderful things, and so on. Now, moving into the 19th century. I'll quickly comment on the French Revolution. when the French Revolution occurred, that also was an occasion for an uptick in millenarianism, because you saw, all this blood, all this destruction, all this chaos, and that was also seen as a sign of the impending apocalypse. Also, when the Napoleonic Wars emerged, Napoleon on his campaigns initially promised to restore the Jews to Palestine, that he would conquer that land from the Ottomans and restore them to it. And upon hearing him make this declaration, many people in America interpreted this as a sign of the end times, saying that Napoleon was sent by God to restore the Jews to their inheritance. Then later, when it turned out that he didn't fulfill this promise, they switched on him and they began calling him the Antichrist. And it sort of went like that. Now, Smith in his book discusses two other, quintessentially American religious movements. The first is Mormonism, which he comments on briefly. And Mormonism really is a quintessentially American religion, because one of the things that really stands out about Mormonism, especially within the context of this tradition of Judeo-centric prophecy interpretation, is that the first Mormons, Joseph Smith, Orson Hyde, and so on, is that they believed in two chosen people: the Israelites, the Jews, and Americans, the other Israelites, the second Israel, the other bride of Christ. So there were two brides of Christ. And in Smith's theology, he had it that there would be the original geographical Jerusalem and another Jerusalem located in America, each for both, each city for each of God's chosen people. Now, he had it that the Jews would receive the earthly kingdom of God. They would inherit, Palestine and so on. But the Christians, by which he meant Protestants and probably more specifically Mormons, would inherit the spiritual kingdom. And so with them began this division into Jews and Americans as two people, two examples of God's people that were united by the fact that they were each God's people, that they were each God's chosen in their own distinct ways. The other person to discuss here is William Miller, the founder of the Seventh-day Adventists. Now, when William Miller and the Millerite movement is discussed today, it's usually ridiculed because Miller was, again, incredibly interested in Judeo-centric prophecy interpretation, and he borrowed the work of English writers, especially Isaac Newton. And another thing about Newton is most of his work, most of his prodigious intellectual energy was put into examining the Bible and trying to interpret the prophecies of the Bible and determine when the end of the world was, but he used Newton's work and the work of some other people and eventually calculated what he believed was an exact date for when Christ would return. He said it would happen sometime between March 21st, 1843 and March 21st, 1844, sometime in that 1 year period. When the final date came and went, he recalculated and said, no, I made a mistake. Not sure how that was determined, but anyway, he said he made a mistake and reformulated a new date and said that new date was in October of 1844. That date came and went and nothing happened. And it was really quite unfortunate because all of his followers, they sold their earthly possessions. They believed that they would be raptured up into heaven. And that's another belief that came with the Seventh-day Adventists, the belief that Christ would come down and would just take away the true believers and zip them up. So after Miller turned out to be wrong a second time, that became known as the Great Disappointment. But the way that Miller differs from nearly everyone else that I've been discussing is he's not Judeo-centric at all. He's a supersessionist, meaning he believes that the covenant the Jews once held with God is now held by Christians, by the Christian church, by the true Christian church, and that therefore God no longer owes Jews anything. As he says, and I think I'm quoting him directly here, he said, the Jew has already had his day. So he was not Judeo-centric at all. And because of this, because he held this position, he was criticized by many Protestant leaders in America and really throughout the world. And so now I come to the person that is usually generally regarded as the father of evangelicalism, and that is John Nelson Darby. John Nelson Darby was a priest in Ireland. He became interested in prophecy interpretation and eschatology and learning about the end times. And eventually he was brought to repudiate all churches everywhere. The church in Ireland, the church in England, all churches everywhere. And he began to counsel his followers to essentially cut themselves off from the world, to not be worldly at all, to not participate in politics at all, to not participate in church life, and to sort of prepare themselves for the return of Christ and for their life, or their, I guess, continued existence in Christ's otherworldly kingdom, which they would be in and go to upon his return. So again, like the Mormons, Darby divided. He drew a sharp distinction between true Christians, which of course meant not Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. And he said that Jews would receive an earthly inheritance, that they would get Israel, and the Christians would be raptured up away, into heaven upon the return of Christ. And then after this rapture, all those who had remained would face the tribulation, which meant the rise of Antichrist and all the chaos caused by him. Now, the most famous, perhaps, idea in all of Darby's work is the idea of the rapture. It's the idea of the rapture, which of course is hugely popular among evangelicals today, and not just evangelicals, American Christians in general, really, to one degree or another. So he believed that essentially there were two brides of Christ. That there were his spiritual bride, which were Christians, true Christians, Protestants, and his earthly bride, the Jews. So what he essentially believed would happen is something like the following, and I've tried hard to remember the sequence of events exactly. He has quite a complicated timeline, so if I make a mistake on any of this, forgive me, because there's a lot to this. Alright, he did not believe, unlike most people that I have been discussing in this now two-part series of videos, that the Jews would have to be converted to Protestantism in order to usher in the apocalypse. He was a premillennialist. He believed that when the appointed time came, Christ would simply return, and that was that. So, upon Christ's return, he would rapture up the elect, his spiritual people, his spiritual bride, Christians, so on, the righteous. They would disappear. They would not be on earth anymore. No, wait a minute. No, I got that wrong. No. The Jews would... Right, Christ would return. Okay, yes, I'm sorry, I got it. Christ would return, he would rapture up the Christians. Jews would then return to Palestine. Those were the two I was confusing. I had it right the first time, I think. Jews would return to Palestine. They would inherit, once again, the land that God had promised them. They would exterminate Islam. They would remove all of the Ottomans, all of the Arabs out of there. They would have that land, and they would reign there, they would have that land, and then Antichrist would emerge. And Antichrist would usher in the tribulation. And the tribulation was a time of great destruction and great terror and trial, where, all the people left on earth, the Jews and everyone else, would be greatly punished. A lot of, people would be killed, a lot of horrible destruction would occur, and so on. And Darby considered this to be punishment meted out by God to the Jews for their responsibility, as he held it to be, for the crucifixion of Christ. Right? So Darby is he's often described as an anti-supersessionist. I've already explained what that means. It's the idea that the covenant made with God by the Jews was transferred over to Christians. He's described as an anti-supersessionist because he, in some sense, does believe the Jews are still the people of God. But this is only a kind of ornamental anti-supersessionism. he believed quite clearly and quite openly that Jews would suffer during the tribulation, and it's really only the Christians that would escape this. He believed that the spiritual nature of the Christian rapture and the fact that they were Christ's spiritual bride made them superior, that they got the better deal of the two groups. And he was not shy about this. So even though on the surface he seems like an anti-supersessionist, in point of fact, he's not, and he actually, taught quite open contempt for Jews. It's just that he believed that they would be elements in the fulfillment of this prophecy, in the acting out and playing out of this grand cosmic drama. And so, like a lot of these other theologians and biblical exegetes that I've discussed in these videos, Darby saw Jews as essentially being chess pieces in a grand cosmic game. Not as not as people in themselves, just sort of players and actors in a cosmic drama. They were sort of like tokens, literary tropes, literary figures almost, that had to play their roles within, the great eschatological drama, the great eschatological conversion, the tribulation, the apocalypse, all of these events. So, as I also mentioned, Darby was strongly anti-political. He quite openly said, I think I may be quoting him exactly here, we do not mix in politics, we are not of this world, we do not vote. Referring, of course, to his followers, of whom he had many. Now, I said that Darby was an Irish theologian, and he did visit America a few times, and he had quite a lot of influence on various American preachers, especially one by the name of Dwight L. Moody. And it was really Moody that began to spread Darby's doctrine throughout the United States. What was called dispensationalism, that was the name of the doctrine. And it's dispensationalism because he believed that the word of God would come out in dispensations, in sort of installments. Like first the Jews would get one, and then later the Christians, and then Christians would be raptured. All this sort of thing in like these stages, these dispensations. But yes, Darby was strongly anti-political. And although to some extent this did catch on among evangelicals in America, in general it did not. Because remember, Americans had this tradition of civil millenarianism, of mixing their religion into their politics and of having them sort of intertwined. Remember this whole New England Puritan tradition of we are the new Israelites, we are the Redeemer nation, and so on. Darby actually, in some of his comments on America, was quite dismayed at what he saw among those who claimed to be following his ideas. He would say things like that, they're even more worldly in America than they are in England. But it's important to point this out because modern Christian Zionism is extremely political, extremely. And Darbyite theology was anything but. It counseled complete withdrawal from the world, not only from politics, but from organized churches, which earned him the ire of many other religious leaders. But although many of his ideas, his dispensationalism, his belief in the rapture, his specific, special kind of methods of biblical interpretation, all the fancy charts that he would use in his books to try and, decipher what's meant by the seven seals, sort of similar to the things that Meade did. All of that was taken in. It was just his otherworldliness that in general was not. And this is important because it explains how it is that a tradition like Christian Zionism, which is, as almost everyone agrees, descended from this man, descended from Darby, because he's the first one to explicitly proclaim the idea of a rapture, how a man so anti-political could have given birth to a tradition as political. Now, there is one other person that I need to discuss because he is very important in creating a sort of a political dimension to Christian Zionism. I was just checking my time there. Anyway, and that last person is William E. Blackstone. He really is a major figure. in active, politically motivated, politically organized Christian Zionism. Now, Blackstone was a businessman who found success early, made his fortune, and decided to remove himself after having done this from the world of business, from the world of commerce, and dedicate himself to religious matters, specifically to Judeo-centric prophecy interpretation once again. Now, and he of course also believed in active political involvement to try and assist Jews as much as possible. He published his first book on this called Jesus is Coming in 1878, in which he again said that there were such and such signs occurring that portended that the end of days was near. And this, of course, roughly coincided with the emergence of political Zionism among Jews, which Blackstone saw as incredibly encouraging. And he did everything he could to assist the likes of Theodor Herzl and the other members of the Zionist conference. He would write to presidents, starting for the first time to Benjamin Harrison in the 1880s or 1890s, because right around that time, or shortly before then, there had been a series of pogroms, anti-Jewish pogroms taking place in Russia, and Blackstone wrote to Benjamin Harrison, the American president at the time, saying, "What shall be done about these Jews? Surely they need a place to go. They need a state of their own where they can be safe, for they are God's people," and so forth and so on. Now, these appeals did not work immediately, but Blackstone was very persistent. I mean, he believed in this very passionately, and he would write letters and petition every president in this way, no matter what political party that president was a part of. He went completely across all the political spectra. He would write to Woodrow Wilson. He would, just so on and on and on and on. Especially his letters to Wilson. His letters to Wilson were quite interesting, because he would say, if you assist the Jews, if you assist the Zionist effort to establish a state in Israel for Jews, for God's people, you will be like Cyrus, like Cyrus the Great. And this was a wonderful thing, because Wilson had his own Messiah complex, and you couldn't possibly think of a better way to appeal to him than that. But yeah, so Blackstone, as well as other very influential Christian Zionists in England, like Lord Salisbury, Anthony Ashley Cooper, who, by the way, it was Anthony Ashley Cooper that popularized the phrase "a land without a people for a people without a land." That was his idea, referring, of course, to Palestine. He popularized the idea that it was uninhabited and Jews could just come in there and form their state. But Blackstone and other Christian Zionists of that sort were working quite strongly and quite closely with Zionist organizations to help establish the state of Israel. It's actually quite funny. There's actually quite a hilarious irony in a lot of Blackstone's work, because he really was one of these progressive kind of social gospel left-wing Christian busybodies. And one of the things that he was responsible for, because he was relentless in terms of his political activism, was the establishment of the International Court of Justice. And this is something that Christian Zionists today regularly deride, because of how the International Court of Justice condemns Israel on a regular basis. So it's funny that this man that these Christian Zionists can trace their intellectual genealogy to was like this. But yeah, so all of these kind of themes were revisited. When Israel was eventually established, or when the United States was seeing kind of the formative moments of Israel, again you had this kind of millenarian ethos spring up again. And they would say, well, the Jews are going in there to form Israel, and they must conquer, they must take over the land and expand and establish themselves, because that is their God-ordained mission as God's people. And comparisons were made between this and the American idea of manifest destiny, going back to the 19th century. Of course, by that time, the American frontier had been conquered. Comparisons were made between what the Jews were doing to the Arabs, and what had happened to the Native Americans previously. Now these comparisons are made today, but today they're made to paint Israel in a negative light. Back then it wasn't like this at all. It was seen as Americans and Jews together as both as God's people, doing their God-ordained mission and expanding themselves. And so, and this was the case among American supporters of Israel. The kind of imperialistic mentality was also emerging in America. Remember, this is early 1900s, late 1800s. We're talking Spanish-American War, the emergence of the start of the American Empire, and the imperialist impulse was happening at right around the same time that Zionism was just becoming a political force. So all these things seem to coalesce. This drive to conquer, this drive to expand, and also this belief dating back to the Puritans that Americans were God's chosen people was sort of projected onto Zionists. And so Americans saw the Jews over there as being like them. And of course a lot of these other tropes were repeated. The Arabs in the way represented, again, this Islamic threat that I've been discussing about this entire tradition. All of these ideas were brought up again. Now there are other things that have happened as well. Also, he discusses briefly the merger between evangelicalism and Christian fundamentalism. Christian fundamentalism essentially started as a kind of an intellectual movement among Bible scholars who were concerned about overly liberal interpretations of Scripture and who wanted to bring back traditional approaches. And they had very traditionalist leanings, and their views, even though originally they were a separate group from the evangelicals, who were very, led by people like Blackstone, who were very politically motivated, they sort of seemed to coalesce. And you have this kind of weird amalgam again of patriotism and American identity, plus all of this Judeo-centric prophecy interpretation, which leads to this millenarian and pro-Jewish outlook. And that's really kind of the end of the chronicle here, for all intents and purposes. But I want to discuss a few things really quickly, a few implications of all of this. So, I'll say this first. If there is one idea, and only one idea, that you take away from watching these two videos, it should be this: that it is part of American culture to be pro-Jewish. That's essentially the lesson that I got from that book. If I can distill its message to one fact, to one claim, it would be this: that it is, in a very important sense, a part of American culture to be pro-Jewish. Now, this is very different from what Israel's defenders say today. They say that Israel is like the United States. The two are similar. That Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and of course America is the great champion of democracy, and so on, and therefore there's this kinship between these two nations. But that's not quite what Smith is saying, and that's not quite how he explains the persistence of pro-Israeli feeling in the United States. There's something about what it is to be American, to be pro-Jewish. It's this kind of civil millennialism arising in this, in a combination of this religious tradition with this kind of imperialistic mentality that developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So it isn't so much that the two cultures are similar as that it's part of American culture to favor Israel. So this idea, and you can say further things. I think that in addition to modern evangelical Christian Zionists like John Hagee, who, by the way, I mean, he has said pretty much unreservedly that he will support Israel no matter what it does, unconditionally. Some people are, especially Christians in particular, a lot of them, especially Catholics, are quite shocked that Hagee would support Israel despite what it does to Palestinian Christians, let's say. And they don't understand why it is that this fanatical support exists. Well, there's a very simple reason. Hagee's belief, and the belief of modern evangelicals and Christian Zionists today, in the rapture and the central place of Israel and the Jews and the state of Israel specifically and all of that, means that they have to support it. It is quite literally part of their religion to be pro-Israel. It is part of their religious beliefs, in such a way, in fact, that if the state of Israel were to ever face a serious threat, if the state of Israel were ever to be destroyed, if the state of Israel were ever to cease to exist, their religion would be proven wrong. So they must do whatever they can to support it in any way they can, which is why this support is so fanatical, so dogged, so strong, so unlikely to ever go away, no matter what Israel does. Now, in addition to these Christian Zionists, I think there's one other group that you can definitely say are, in a way, sort of the inheritors of this tradition, and of course I'm talking about the neoconservatives. If the neocons are not modern-day millenarians, then I don't know who is. I mean, just look at Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, right? He thinks in that book, his most famous book, I'd say, that democracy as a political system had, with the fall of the Soviet Union, essentially triumphed over all alternative political systems in the world. And, like many other neocons, he believes that America has the right to go forth and spread freedom and democracy and these wonderful things, given that America is this stronghold of these wonderful values. So again, you see this puritanical idea of America being one of God, God's chosen people, the bastion of freedom, that all of these Puritans believed in the Revolutionary era. And there's also the millenarianism, the idea of the democratic millennium, that democracy has conquered the world and dictatorship is gone forever, according to Fukuyama, and now we're going to enjoy, a wonderful millennium of democracy. If that's not a millenarian book, I don't know what is. Then there are also organizations like, that group of neocons that pushed for the Iraq War, the Project for a New American Century. I have a feeling that the only reason they didn't call themselves the Project for a New American Millennium is that would sound too grandiose. Now this is actually rather ironic, because if you look at neoconservative historians, they tend, unless they are specifically religious, like Harry Jaffa, they tend to downplay the effect of religion on American culture and on the American founding. They say that the Founding Fathers were all secularists. This kind of religious nationalism that I described among the Puritans was not an influential force in the forming of America, which is of course wrong. It was. But anyway, I just wanted to kind of share this view that it seems to me that the neocons are one of the inheritors of this millenarian tradition, which I think explains very well why they tend to agree on so many points with Christian evangelicals, especially with regard to support for Israel. And neoconservative support for Israel is another weird topic that I don't want to discuss, because that's another video in and of itself. But with all of this, with all of these things I've said, just a few final points before I run out of time. I have a few minutes left. What I've discussed here, what I've talked about, can help in analyzing a few things. For example, John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt's book on the Israel lobby, which claims that there is an Israel lobby that essentially tightly controls American foreign policy and determines what the American government does in the Middle East and in other places, despite the fact that American support for Israel has absolutely zero strategic benefit to the United States. And he says that despite this complete and utter, this obvious lack of strategic benefit, the reason that the United States continues to help Israel is because of the power of the Israel lobby. Now, I am not trying to say that I deny the influence of the Israel lobby. I'm not saying that they don't have influence. I'm not saying that they don't have sway. But I will say this: were it not for this long tradition of American thought, this forming of American identity around Judeo-centric and millenarian lines, I don't think that they would have any influence. As I said, the central idea of this book, of Smith's book, as it seems to me, is that for a number of reasons relating to the culture of the Puritans that first settled the United States, and how their view tended to influence the American Revolution and subsequent periods in American history, it has come to be the case that it is simply part of American culture to be pro-Jewish. I think that is what ultimately empowers the Israel lobby. I think I think that is the ultimate source for American support for the State of Israel, despite all of these weird things, despite the fact that it offers no strategic benefit to the U.S. government, despite the fact that it does not share the democratic values that it claims to share with the United States, Hasbara propaganda notwithstanding. And also, I think you can use what's discussed in this book to offer a rather interesting and thoughtful critique of a number of writers who have talked about Israel, from Norman Finkelstein to Kevin MacDonald. Norman Finkelstein, in his book Knowing Too Much, predicts that American support for Israel will eventually end because his knowledge of Israel's atrocities spreads throughout the news, and as American Jews learn more and more about it, given how cerebral and literate they tend to be, as they learn more about it, they will find that support for Israel will tend to conflict with their predominantly liberal beliefs, and so over time, as this tension becomes stronger and stronger, they will cease to support Israel with the kind of fervor that they support it with, which will then lead to the end of American support for Israel, or so Finkelstein claims. Now, I think he is right about American Jews eventually ceasing to support Israel, but I don't think he's correct that this implies that American support for Israel will end. Even if American Jews stop supporting it, you still have these evangelical Christians. You still have this entire cultural context of pro-Jewishness being a part of American identity, and of the belief that Americans are the new Israelites dating back to the Puritans. This is going to be harder to eliminate than than it would be to change the opinions of a few American Jews on the basis of some atrocities that Israel has committed. I mean, even if we just think of the evangelicals, as I said, these people have, the support for Israel is really the central tenet of their religion, the evangelicals. They will support Israel unconditionally, no matter what it does. They don't care. They evaluate the righteousness or unrighteousness of someone by the degree to which that person supports Israel. That their support is not going to go away. So this problem is much more serious than I think even Finkelstein realizes. Although I think he is right, at least insofar as American Jews and their attitudes to Israel are concerned. I just don't think that it implies an end to American support for Israel. Also there's Kevin MacDonald. I don't have much time to discuss him, but essentially in one of his books, The Culture of Critique, he thinks that 20th century Jewish intellectual movements are part of an evolutionary survival strategy to sort of whittle down and break down Western culture by Jews so that they can sort of blend in more easily with the surrounding environment and aren't as threatened. That this is kind of a group evolutionary survival strategy. And I don't know nearly enough about genetics to say whether he's right, but even if he is, you have this Judeo-centric prophecy interpretation informing American culture, and that's a big deal. So I think you could just as easily attribute the influence of Jews on things like multiculturalism in American society to the prevalence of this tradition, to the general pro-Jewish character of American culture and of Protestantism. And MacDonald, I think, knows quite a bit about Protestantism, so he'd probably agree with this. I'm not quite sure. But in any event, that's all I wanted to say, and I hope that I've shed some light on the mystery of American support for Israel. So, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for listening. Oh, and once again, before I run out of time, the book is More Desired Than Our Own Salvation by Robert O. Smith. I will link to it in the description. Buy the book. It's wonderful. It's very informative. It's dense. There's a lot to read. There's a lot to remember. I'm amazed I remembered as much as I did. But it's a great book. You'll enjoy it. You'll learn a lot from it. Buy it. Thank you for listening.